I moved to Sycamore Grove for the peace and quiet, or so I thought. It's the kind of neighborhood where the sidewalks are always clean, the lawns are trimmed to within an inch of their lives, and the houses all have the same tasteful shade of beige, as if individuality itself had been gently but firmly power-washed away. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, oversees everything with the iron grip of a dictator who's read too many bylaws and not enough literature on basic human decency. Unfortunately for me, Sycamore Grove has a queen, and her name is Margaret Greeley. She's the kind of woman who could turn a missing mailbox number into a federal crime, the type who prowls the neighborhood in her golf cart like a medieval tax collector, scanning for the slightest infraction. She's got that peculiar mix of self-importance and deep personal emptiness that turns some people into tyrants. And I, completely by accident, had made myself her latest target. It started innocently enough. I decided to paint my front door. Nothing crazy, just a nice, deep navy blue. It had been an awful shade of eggshell white before, the kind of color that made you feel like you were in a dentist's waiting room every time you pulled into the driveway. I figured it was a small change, one that would add a little character to my otherwise generic-looking home. The very next morning, there it was, a bright pink violation notice taped aggressively to my door. Unapproved exterior modification. Immediate remediation required. I stared at the note, then at the door, then back at the note. Seriously? It's a door. A few hours later, Margaret herself showed up. Short, wiry, and wearing a lemon-yellow power suit that screamed, "Small-town despot." She didn't knock. She tapped on my door with a single manicured nail, a sound that somehow managed to convey condescension in Morse code. "Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice dripping with a practiced politeness that didn't quite mask the contempt. "I see you've made an, unauthorized change to your property." I smiled. "Oh, the door? Yeah, I just thought it needed a little life. Looks nice, doesn't it?" She did not smile back. "Unfortunately, per HOA guidelines, all exterior colors must be pre-approved. And well, blue is simply not on the approved list." I raised an eyebrow. "Then what is?" She handed me a printed list. It contained 4 colors: eggshell white, off-white, light beige, and slightly darker beige. I laughed. I thought she'd laugh too. She did not. "I'm afraid you'll have to repaint it immediately," she said, tilting her head like a disapproving schoolteacher. "Failure to comply will result in daily fines." "Daily fines," I repeated. "For a door." "For an unapproved modification," she corrected, as if she were explaining basic arithmetic to an idiot. That was the moment I should have known. This was never about a door. I could have caved then. Maybe I should have. But something about Margaret's smug certainty, the way she was so sure of her authority, made me decide otherwise. I nodded, smiled. "I'll take care of it." And I did, by painting it a slightly darker shade of blue. That's when Margaret declared war. First came the passive-aggressive notices, typed in all caps with phrases like "final warning" and "non-compliance will not be tolerated." Then the fines started piling up, absurd numbers, like $50 a day for visual disharmony. Then the late fees, I ignored them. Then I started getting anonymous complaints, one about my lawn being 1 4-inch too tall. I measured, exactly 1 4-inch. Another about my garbage cans being set out 3 minutes too early. Then, the most ridiculous one yet, an official notice demanding I remove an unauthorized garden gnome from my porch. I don't own a garden gnome, but Margaret had included a printed photo of one sitting smugly on my front steps. And sure enough, when I got home, there it was. Someone, Margaret, was planting violations. That's when I realized she wasn't just enforcing rules. She was creating them. And then, the final straw, a formal letter. Due to repeated willful violations, the HOA board is initiating proceedings to revoke your residency in Sycamore Grove. I read the letter 3 times, just to be sure. Margaret. wasn't finding me anymore. She was trying to evict me, for a door, for an imaginary garden gnome, for daring to exist in a way she didn't like. I was still staring at the letter, half laughing, half enraged, when my phone rang. "Hey, it's Jeff," said my lawyer. "So, you're going to want to sit down for this." I sat. Margaret just filed the motion to start the eviction process. "But there's something she doesn't know," Jeff said. I frowned. "What?" Jeff chuckled. "Turns out you don't just own your house." I blinked. "What the hell does that mean?" "It means," Jeff said, drawing out the pause for dramatic effect, "you own her house too." I almost dropped the phone. "Come again?" "Not just her house," Jeff said, his voice positively gleeful now. "The whole damn street." I sat there, mouth open, as the realization sank in. Margaret was trying to evict me from my own property, and just like that, the game had changed. I gripped the phone tighter. "Jeff, what the hell are you talking about?" Jeff chuckled. "Yeah, I had to double-check it myself. See, Sycamore Grove was built on a weird land trust deal from the 80s. Most of the houses here aren't technically owned outright. They're part of a leasehold estate. You own the land beneath the homes, not just your own, but all 12 properties on the street, including Margaret's." I blinked. "So, Margaret doesn't actually own her house?" "Not in the way she thinks." Jeff. "Confirmed. Technically, she's leasing it, like everyone else here. And guess who holds those leases?" I felt a slow, wicked grin forming. "Me. You," Jeff confirmed. "And if she's dumb enough to push this eviction case, well, that would be real unfortunate. For her, considering you're technically her landlord." I let out a breath. Oh, this is going to be fun. But I had to be careful. I couldn't let Margaret know what I knew. Not yet. If she was already this unhinged when she thought she had power, I could only imagine what she'd do if she realized she was standing on my land. So I played along. Over the next few days, I let the circus continue. I forgot to repaint the door, racking up more ridiculous fines. Mysterious violations kept appearing, each more laughable than the last. Unauthorized bird feeder, grass too green, hose coiled in a disorderly manner. Then, Margaret escalated. I came home one evening to find a literal tow truck idling in my driveway. 2 guys in reflective vests stood beside it, one tapping at an iPad. "Can I help you?" I asked. "Yeah," one of the guys said. "We got a removal order for an abandoned vehicle on the property." I stared at him, then at my perfectly non-abandoned car sitting in the driveway. "You mean my car?" He glanced at the screen. "Says here the HOA reported it as inoperable and unsightly." My car was a 2021 Honda Accord. Margaret, I forced a smile. "Tell you what, fellas, why don't you hold off on that for a second?" I turned on my heel and marched straight to her house. She opened the door with the smug certainty of someone who just won a battle. "Oh," she said, feigning surprise. "Mr. Calloway, what a pleasant—" "Cut the crap, Margaret." I held up my keys. "That's my car." She folded her arms, lips pursed. "I'm afraid the HOA has very strict guidelines about abandoned vehicles." "Margaret, I drove it here this morning." She shrugged. "That's not what our records say." I took a step closer. "Margaret, if my car gets towed, I'm billing you for it, and I'll make sure you pay every cent." Her smug expression faltered, just for a second, but then she squared her shoulders. "Rules are rules," she said. That's when I knew. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was personal. Margaret wanted me gone, and she wasn't stopping until she got what she wanted. The next morning, I woke up to an official summons. Margaret had made good on her threat. She'd actually filed for my eviction. I stared at the document in disbelief, then let out a slow whistle. She had no idea. She was walking into her own doom. But I still had to play my part. I let her revel in her victory for a few more days. She paraded around the neighborhood, dropping smug hints to the other residents about getting rid of troublemakers and restoring order. I even overheard her on the phone outside one afternoon. Yes, I'll be assuming ownership of the property. Soon, she said, voice dripping with arrogance. Once the nuisance is gone, we can move forward with new community enhancements. I stifled a laugh. She was already planning her takeover. Then, just when she thought she'd won, I made my move. The night before our court hearing, I called Jeff. Let's do it. The next morning, we arrived at the courthouse. Margaret sat across from me, dressed in another one of her power suits, looking like she'd already picked out the drapes for her soon-to-be new property. When the judge called our case, she rose with the confidence of a woman who had never lost a battle. Your Honor, she began, as president of the Sycamore Grove HOA, I am here to enforce community standards. Mr. Calloway has repeatedly violated our bylaws, refused to comply, and has left us no choice but to pursue eviction. She turned to me with a smirk. Unfortunately, he simply does not belong in our community. Silence. Then Jeff stood. Your Honor, my client has some clarifications regarding ownership of the property in question. Margaret waved a dismissive hand. There's no clarification needed. The HOA has full authority. Jeff slid a stack of documents onto the judge's desk. Actually, per the original land trust agreement for Sycamore Grove, the defendant not only owns his home, but every home on the street, including the plaintiff's. Margaret's smirk froze. Excuse me? You heard him, I said, grinning. I own your house, Margaret. Silence. Then, for the first time since I met her, Margaret stuttered. This is ridiculous. Impossible. Jeff pulled out another document. Would you like to see the lease agreement, the one that you signed? Margaret snatched the papers from his hands, eyes scanning frantically, the color drained from her face, and then, the moment of pure gold, You can't evict me, she sputtered. That would be... I leaned forward. Unlawful. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. It was delicious, but we weren't done yet. Margaret wasn't going down easy, because just when I thought I had her cornered, she did something no one expected. She slammed her hand on the table. I want to buy the street. The judge blinked. I'm sorry, what? She straightened her jacket, regaining some of her composure. I'll make an offer. Whatever he paid for it, I'll double it. The community deserves to be in the right hands. I leaned back in my chair, watching her. She was desperate, but she was also playing a new game, and I had no intention of letting her win. Margaret squared her shoulders like a poker player about to bluff her way out of bankruptcy. I'll make an offer for the street, she repeated. Whatever you paid, I'll double it. Jeff let out a low whistle. Bold move, he murmured. I just smiled. Margaret, I said, do you even know how much the street is worth? She hesitated just for a second. Whatever it is, I can afford it, she snapped. No, you can't, I said smoothly, because I didn't pay anything for it. She blinked. The land trust passed to me as an inheritance, I continued. $0, which means... I leaned forward, grinning. Double that would still be 0. Margaret's face twitched. The judge suppressed a smile. Jeff, enjoying this, far too much, spread his hands. Your Honor, my client declines the offer. He will be maintaining ownership of his land. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then, in a last-ditch effort to regain control, she scoffed. Well, that doesn't change the fact that he still has to comply with HOA regulations. I smiled wider. Funny thing about that, I said, because you see, Margaret, as the landowner, I'm entitled to dissolve the HOA at will. The heat color drained from her face. Wait, Jeff slid another document onto the table. Per the bylaws of the original agreement, the HOA exists at the discretion of the landowner. Since my client is, in fact, the owner of this land, he tapped the paper. He formally dissolves the Sycamore Grove HOA effective immediately. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. Margaret looked at the judge, wild-eyed, like she was expecting divine intervention. The judge just shrugged. "Legally sound," he said. "The HOA is dissolved." I could see the precise moment Margaret's world crumbled. No more rules, no more fines, no more power. Her hands trembled as she reached for her purse. "This is a joke," she muttered. This is justice," I offered helpfully. She spun on me. "You don't understand what you've done," she shrieked. "You've destroyed this neighborhood. You've doomed it to chaos." "Chaos?" I raised an eyebrow. "Margaret, I painted my door blue," she bristled. "And it ruined the uniformity. And what happens next? Lawn flamingos? Inflatable Santas? People parking wherever they want?" I grinned. God, I hope so. She was seething now, her carefully constructed world crumbling like a sandcastle in a hurricane. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You think you've won, but..." She never got to finish, because at that moment, something incredible happened. A slow applause started from the back of the courtroom. One person, then another, then another. The residents of Sycamore Grove, her own neighbors, were clapping. Not for her. For me. Margaret's face twisted in confusion. She turned, looking at them, as if seeing them for the first time. Mr. Patel, the elderly man she'd fined for having a sunflower in his yard, smiled at me. The Johnsons, the couple she'd threatened over their holiday lights, nodded approvingly. Even Mrs. Langley, the woman Margaret had once humiliated for daring to leave her garbage can out 5 minutes past pickup, was wiping away happy tears. Margaret looked like she'd been slapped. "You?" she started, but she couldn't even form the words. The judge banged his gavel. "Case dismissed. The HOA is officially dissolved." And with that, it was over. The aftermath was glorious. The very next day, Sycamore Grove came alive. Lawn flamingos appeared overnight. Front doors turned into a rainbow of rebellion. Reds, greens, purples. Someone even painted their garage bright yellow out of sheer spite. Jeff sent me a text that morning. "Congrats. You've started a revolution." And as for Margaret, she tried to cling to control. She sent strongly worded letters. Ignored. She tried rallying the residents. They laughed her out. She even attempted to create a private HOA with a few die-hard rule lovers. But with no legal power, it was about as effective as a wet napkin in a hurricane. Then, the final blow. 1 week later, she put her house up for sale. It was over. I should have let her fade into obscurity. But, well, I had one last dose of poetic. Justice left to deliver. The morning of her open house, I paid a visit. She opened the door, saw me, and groaned. "What do you want?" she snapped. I smiled. "I came to make an offer." Her eyes narrowed. You want to buy my house?" I nodded. "At market value, of course." She looked skeptical, but the desperation in her eyes betrayed her. She wanted out. "Fine," she said stiffly. "Make your offer." I handed her an envelope. She snatched it, pulled out the paper, and read it, then screeched. Because I hadn't offered money, I had offered one free garden gnome. She threw the paper at me and slammed the door. I walked away, grinning. A month later, she was gone, and Sycamore Grove, it was better than ever. No more Margaret, no more ridiculous fines, no more dictatorship over door colors, and on my front lawn, standing proudly for all to see, a single, glorious, smug little garden gnome. Because sometimes revenge is best served ceramic.